Spring came slowly to Vera 7, and the snow began to melt, and the days grew longer, and the colonists emerged from their winter isolation with relief and hope in their hearts. A full year had passed since the Draconith warships had descended on the colony and taken their emperor home, and life had returned to its normal rhythm, and the people went about their business, and the seasons turned and time moved forward as it always did. Tazik continued to run the warm cup, and he opened the shop every morning and closed it every night, and he served coffee to the colonists, and he smiled and made conversation, and no one would have known that he carried a quiet sadness in his heart. The colonists treated him differently now, and there was a kind of awe in the way they looked at him, because word had spread about what the emperor had said, and everyone knew that the quiet coffee shop owner was a friend of the throne of the Draconith Dominion. But Taisik did not care about titles or honors, and he only cared about the empty corner table where his friend used to sit, and he only cared about the coffee cup that sat unused on the shelf, waiting for its owner to return. News reached Vera 7 through the trade ships that visited the colony, and the news was strange and wonderful, and hard to believe. The Draconith Dominion had signed unprecedented trade agreements with human worlds, and new protections for human colonies had been enacted across the galaxy, and diplomatic relations between the two species had improved dramatically, and no one could explain why. Some said that the emperor had gone mad, and others said that the emperor had found religion, and others said that the emperor was playing some long game that no one could understand. Only Taisik knew the truth, and he smiled when he heard the news, and he thought about his friend sitting on a throne somewhere far away, and he hoped that Sioho was finding some measure of peace. It was a warm spring evening when the ship appeared in the sky above Vera 7, and it was not a warship this time, but a diplomatic vessel, and it descended through the clouds with grace and elegance and landed in the field outside the settlement. The colonists gathered to watch, and they whispered among themselves and wondered what this new visit could mean, and Taisik stood at the window of his shop and watched with his heart pounding in his chest. The hatch opened and a procession emerged, and at the head of the procession was a figure in magnificent imperial regalia, and the robes were made of fabric that shimmered like captured starlight, and the crown was made of metal that seemed to burn within her. Fire Emperor Siolwa the Eternal walked through the settlement with their entourage behind them, and the colonists dropped to their knees as they passed, and the governor and the officials rushed forward to offer greetings and hospitality, but the emperor did not stop for any of them, and they walked past the kneeling colonists and past the stammering officials, and they walked directly to the warm cup, and they pushed open the door, and Enera Taisik was waiting behind the counter with 2 cups of coffee already prepared, and he smiled when he saw his friend. "You came back," he said. Siolwa's golden eyes were bright with emotion, and the imperial mask cracked, and underneath it, Taisik could see the being he had befriended on those long winter nights. "I told my court that I was traveling here to negotiate critical treaties," Siolwa said as they walked toward the corner table. "And I am, and these are the most critical treaties I have ever negotiated." "What treaties are those?" Taisik asked as he carried the coffee to the table and sat down across from his friend. Siolwa reached up and removed the burning crown from their head and set it on the table as if it weighed nothing at all. "The Treaty of Friendship," they said. "The treaty that says that once a year the Emperor of the Draconith Dominion will travel to a small colony on the edge of human space and drink coffee with a human man and remember what it feels like to be just a person." Taisik laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine and full of joy. "I think that is a treaty I can support," he said. "Same blend as always." "Same blend," Siolwa agreed. "Same table and same friend." They sat together and drank their coffee and talked about the year that had passed, and Siolwa told Taisik about the changes they had made and the enemies they had faced and the small victories they had won. "The trade agreements with human worlds were because of you," Siolwa admitted. I kept thinking about what you told me about sharing food and drink, and about how humans use these rituals to build trust and connection, and I thought that perhaps the Dominion could learn something from your species. And has it worked? Tysic asked. It has, Siowa said, and there was wonder in their voice. The humans we have negotiated with have been surprised by our willingness to share meals with them and to treat them as equals. And somehow the negotiations have gone better than any we have had before. And my advisors cannot understand it, but I understand it. You understand that kindness is not weakness. Tysic said. I understand that kindness is strength. Siowa replied. I understand that the mightiest ruler in the galaxy is still a being who needs connection and compassion and friendship, and I understand that these things are not found in courts or palaces, but in small coffee shops on frozen worlds. They sat in comfortable silence for a while and watched the spring. Evening settle over the colony, and the light was golden and warm, and the world felt peaceful and right. I have something for you, Siowa said, and they reached into their robes and pulled out a small object and placed it on the table. It was a cup made of metal that gleamed like captured starlight, and it was engraved with symbols that Tysic did not recognize, and it was beautiful beyond anything he had ever seen. This is a cup from the Imperial Collection. Siowa's enlegend. It is over 1,000 years old, and it has been used by emperors and conquerors and legends, and now I give it to you. Tysic looked at the cup and then looked at his friend and shook his head with a gentle smile. I cannot accept this, he said. It is too valuable, and it belongs in your palace, and not in a coffee shop on a frontier world. It belongs wherever I say it belongs, Siowa replied, and their voice was warm with affection. And I say it belongs here with you because this is where I learned what truly matters, and this is where I found something that all my wealth and power could not buy. Tysic picked up the cup and felt its weight in his hands, and he thought about everything that had happened since that cold winter night when a lonely stranger had stood outside his shop. Then I will keep it, he said, and I will use it to serve you coffee whenever you visit, and it will remind us both that friendship is more precious than any treasure. Siowa smiled, and it was a smile that transformed their ancient face and made them look young and hopeful. That is exactly what I wanted, they said. Outside the shop, the entourage waited with barely concealed impatience, and the officials wondered what could possibly be taking so long, and the colonists whispered about the strange relationship between their neighbor and the most powerful being in the Draconith Dominion, but inside the warm cup none of that mattered, and the Emperor and the coffee shop owner sat together as equals and shared the simple pleasure of good coffee and good company, and the bond between them was stronger than any treaty and more enduring than any empire. And so it was that the mightiest ruler among the Draconith learned the greatest lesson that humanity had to offer, and it was not a lesson about war or technology or conquest, and it was simply this: the kindness freely given is the most powerful force in the universe, and that a cup of coffee shared with a friend is worth more than all the stars in the sky. The spring sun set over Vera 7 and the first stars appeared, and somewhere across the galaxy, great events were unfolding, and empires were rising and falling, and history was being written. But in the small coffee shop on the edge of human space, none of that seemed important, and the only thing that mattered was the warmth of the coffee and the comfort of friendship and the quiet joy of two beings who had found each other across the vast emptiness of the cosmos. The storm had passed 3 days ago, and life on Vera 7 had returned to its normal rhythm, and the colonists went about their business, and the snow sparkled in the pale winter sunlight, and everything seemed peaceful, and ordinary Tysic was preparing for the evening rush when he heard the sound, and it was a sound that did not belong on this quiet frontier world, and it was the deep, rumbling roar of starship engines descending through the atmosphere. He walked to the window and looked up at the Sky and his blood ran cold at what he saw. 3 massive warships were dropping through the clouds, and they were shaped like great serpents, made of metal and fire, and they bore the insignia of the Draconith Dominion, and they were the largest vessels that had ever visited this small colony. The colonists were running through the streets in panic, and mothers were gathering their children, and shopkeepers were closing their doors, and everyone was terrified because the arrival of Draconith warships usually meant conquest or destruction. Tasik watched the ships land in the fields outside the settlement, and he watched the hatches open, and he watched as rows of Draconith soldiers marched out in perfect formation, and their armor gleamed like black diamonds, and their weapons hummed with deadly energy. He did not run, and he did not hide, and he simply stood at the window and watched and waited. The soldiers marched through the colony with precision and purpose, and the colonists scattered before them like leaves before a wind, and no one dared to stand in their way or question their presence. At the head of the formation walked a Draconith, in armor more ornate than the others, and his scales were deep crimson, and his eyes burned with authority, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone who was accustomed to absolute obedience. The formation stopped in front of the warm cup, and the Crimson Draconith stepped forward and pushed open the door and entered the shop with his soldiers close behind. Tasik stood behind his counter and faced them without flinching, and his heart was pounding, but his face was calm. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if heavily armed soldiers entered his coffee shop every day. The Crimson Draconith ignored him, and his burning eyes swept across the room until they found Seal was sitting at the corner table, and then he strode forward and dropped to his knees with a crash of armor. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said, and his voice rang with relief and respect. "We have searched for you across 100 worlds, and we have finally found you, and I am here to escort you home." Tasik looked at Seolwa, and Seolwa looked back at him, and in that moment, Tasik saw his friend transform. The weary traveler in worn clothes was gone, and in their place sat a being of terrifying majesty, and those golden eyes that had wept 3 nights ago were now cold and regal, and the slumped shoulders were now straight. With authority, "Lord Hyunseo," Seolwa said, and their voice had changed too, and it was no longer the quiet voice of a lonely wanderer, but the commanding tone of absolute power. "You may rise." The Crimson Draconith rose to his feet, and his eyes never left his ruler. "Your Majesty, the court is in chaos without you," he said. "Your enemies grow bold, and your allies grow fearful, and the Dominion needs its emperor." Seolwa nodded slowly and began to rise from the table, and Tasik felt something cold settle in his chest, because he understood now that his friend was leaving and might never return. Lord Hyunseo turned his burning gaze on Tasik, and his lip curled with contempt. "Kneel before Emperor Seolwa the Eternal," he commanded, "ruler of the Draconith Dominion and keeper of the 17 flames, and show proper respect to your superior." Tasik met the Lord's gaze steadily and did not kneel. "I do not kneel to customers who have not paid their tab," he said. Calmly, the silence that followed was absolute, and the soldiers shifted uneasily, and Lord Hyunseo's face twisted with rage. "You dare!" he snarled, and his hand moved toward his weapon. "You insignificant creature, and you dare to show such disrespect to the Emperor, and I will teach you the proper way to address your betters." "You will do no such thing," Seolwa said, and their voice cut through the tension like a blade. Lord Hyunseo froze and turned to look at his ruler with confusion in his eyes. "Your Majesty," he began, but Seolwa raised a clawed hand and silenced him. "This man is Yun Tasik," Seolwa said, and they walked toward the counter where Tasik stood. "He gave me shelter when I was cold, and he gave me food when I was hungry, and he gave me friendship when I was alone, and he defended me against those who would do me harm, and he asked for nothing in return." The Emperor of the Draconith Dominion stood before the coffee shop owner, and their golden eyes were soft with emotion. "By my authority as Emperor, I declare Yun Tasik to be a friend of the throne." HFY announced, and their voice rang with power. He is under my personal protection, and no Draconith may harm him or threaten him, or show him disrespect, and this decree is eternal and absolute. Lord Hihansio's face was a mask of shock, and the soldiers behind him exchanged bewildered glances because the title of Friend of the Throne had not been granted in over 200 years, and it was one of the highest honors the Emperor could bestow. HFY turned back to Taisik and the Imperial mask slipped just a little, and underneath it Taisik could see his friend. I must return, HFY said quietly. I have responsibilities that I cannot abandon forever, and my people need me, even if many of them do not love me, and I must go back to being the Emperor. Taisik nodded, and he felt the grief rising in his chest, but he pushed it down because this moment was not about him. I understand, he said. You have a duty, and you cannot run from it forever, and I would never ask you to. But I will not forget. HFY continued, and their voice was thick with emotion. I will never forget what you gave me, and I will never forget that. For a few weeks on this frozen world, I was just HFY, and I had a friend who saw me as a person and not as a crown. Taisik reached out and took HFY's clawed hand in his own one last time. The door is always open, he said, and the coffee is always ready, and if you ever need to be just HFY again, you know where to find me. HFY squeezed his hand and then let go, and the Imperial mask settled back into place, and the Emperor of the Draconith Dominion turned and walked toward the door with Lord Hyunseo and the soldiers falling into formation behind them. At the threshold, HFY paused and looked back one more time. Thank you, young Taisik, they said, for everything, and then they were gone, and Taisik was alone in his coffee shop, and he stood there for a long time, looking at the empty corner table and feeling the weight of absence settle over him. Outside, the Draconith warships rose into the sky and disappeared into the clouds, and the colonists emerged from their hiding places, and life on Vera 7 slowly returned to normal. But Taisik knew that nothing would ever be quite the same, and he knew that he would spend every evening looking at that corner table and hoping that one day his friend would return. He picked up the coffee cup that HFY had left behind, and he washed it carefully, and he set it on the shelf behind the counter, and he did not use it again, because it was waiting for its owner to come back. The storm came without warning in the deep of midwinter, and it was the worst storm that Vera 7 had seen in a decade, and the wind howled like a living thing, and the snow fell so thick that a person could not see their own hand in front of their faces. HFY had arrived at the warm cup just before the storm hit, and now they sat at their usual table, while the wind rattled the windows and the building creaked and groaned under the assault of the weather. You cannot go out in this, Taisik said as he looked at the white wall of snow beyond the glass. The temperature has dropped far below freezing, and even a Draconith would struggle in conditions like these. HFY nodded slowly, and their golden eyes reflected the warm light of the lamps that Taisik had lit when the power flickered. I will impose on your hospitality then, they said. If you do not mind my company for the night, I would welcome it, Taisik replied, and he meant it because the storm made the world feel small and lonely, and having someone to share that feeling with made it easier to bear. He made a fresh pot of coffee and brought out some food that he kept in the back room, and he set everything on the table and sat down across from HFY. And for a while they simply ate and drank in comfortable silence while the storm raged outside. It was Taisik who spoke first, and his voice was soft and distant, as if he was speaking to himself as much as to HFY. I had a wife once, he said. Her name was Minjung, and she was the kindest person I ever knew, and she could make anyone feel welcome, and she could make any place feel like home. HFY set down their coffee cup and gave Taisik their full attention, and their ancient eyes were gentle with understanding. What happened to her? They asked quietly. There was an accident, Taisik said, and his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth. on the station where we lived, and there was a hull breach, and she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I was not there to save her." He paused and took a breath and continued speaking with the careful control of someone who had lived with grief for a long time. "After she died, I could not stay there anymore because everything reminded me of her, and I could not walk down a corridor without expecting to see her face, and I could not sleep in our quarters without reaching for her in the night and finding only empty space. So you came here," HFY said, and it was not a question. "So I came here," Tyzik agreed. "I came to the edge of human space, and I built this shop, and I started over, and it has been 3 years now, and the pain is still there, but it is not as sharp as it used to be, and I have found a kind of peace here." HFY was quiet for a long moment, and then they spoke, and their voice carried the weight of centuries. "I understand loss," they said. "I have lived for a very long time, Tyzik, and I have lost more than I can count, and the pain does not go away. But you learn to carry it, and you learn to keep moving forward, even when the weight feels unbearable." Tyzik looked at his friend, and he saw something in those golden eyes that he had not seen before, and it was a reflection of his own grief, multiplied by hundreds of years. "Tell me," he said simply. "Tell me what you carry." HFY took a deep breath, and their clawed hands trembled slightly as they wrapped around their coffee cup. "I rule something vast," they said, and their voice was barely above a whisper. "I have ruled it for over 400 years, and I have watched empires rise and fall, and I have made decisions that affected billions of lives, and I have borne the responsibility of my position without complaint." They paused and looked at Tyzik, and their eyes were searching his face for any sign of fear or judgment, but they found only patience and compassion. "My court is full of enemies who smile to my face and plot behind my back, and my own children scheme against me because they want my throne. And they do not care that I am their parent, and they only see me as an obstacle to be removed." Tyzik listened without interrupting, and he did not react to the implications of what HFY were revealing, and he simply let them speak and let them unburden themselves. "I have not had a true friend in over 400 years," HFY continued, and their voice cracked with emotion. "Everyone who approaches me wants something, and everyone who speaks to me has an agenda, and I cannot trust anyone, because trust is a weakness that my enemies would exploit, and I am so tired, Tyzik, and I am so alone." The storm howled outside, and the lamps flickered, and Tyzik reached across the table and took HFY's clawed hand in his own. "Does it not frighten you?" HFY asked, and their voice was small and vulnerable. "What I might be, and what I might be capable of, and does it not terrify you to know that you have been sharing coffee with someone who could destroy worlds with a single command?" Tyzik thought about the question, and he thought about the being sitting across from him, and he thought about all the evenings they had spent together in this small shop on the edge of human space. "You came here tired and alone," he said gently. "You came here looking for warmth and company, and you came here because you needed something that all your power could not give you, and whatever else you are does not change that, and it does not change the fact that you are my friend." Something broke behind HFY's golden eyes, and the walls that had stood for centuries crumbled, and for the first time in 400 years the Emperor of the Draconith Dominion wept. The tears that fell from those ancient eyes were like liquid gold, and they traced paths down scaled cheeks and dropped onto the wooden table, and HFY made no move to hide them or wipe them away. Tyzik did not speak, and he did not offer empty words of comfort, and he simply held his friend's hand and sat with them in their pain, and let them know through his presence that they were not alone. Storm raged outside, and the night stretched on, and in the small warm shelter of the warm cup, a human and an emperor sat together and shared the burden of grief and loneliness, and neither of them spoke because some moments did not need words. When the tears finally stopped, HFY looked at Tyzik with eyes that were raw and vulnerable, and more honest than they had been in centuries. "Thank you," they whispered. "Thank you for seeing me and not just what I represent. And thank you for treating me like a person instead of a symbol. And thank you for being my friend." Tyzik smiled and squeezed Silva's hand gently. "That is what friends do," he said. "Now drink your coffee before it gets cold." And Silva laughed, and it was a sound like thunder and bells, and it was the first genuine laugh they had made in 400 years, and it filled the small coffee shop with warmth that had nothing to do with the heating system. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the warm cup, two friends sat together and talked through the night and shared their burdens and found that the weight was easier to carry when it was shared. The winter wind cut through the streets of the small human colony on Verith 7 like a blade made of ice, and the few people still outside hurried toward their homes with their heads down and their coats pulled tight against the cold Eon. Tyzik stood behind the counter of his coffee shop and watched the snow fall through the window, and he thought about how quiet the evening had become and how the warmth of his shop felt like a small island in a frozen sea. The warm cup was not a grand establishment and was not famous or wealthy, but it was his, and he had built it with his own hands after leaving everything behind 3 years ago. And he loved every worn wooden table and every chipped ceramic mug that sat upon the shelves he was cleaning. The counterweight noticed the figure standing across the street. The stranger was tall and wrapped in a traveling cloak that had seen better days, and they stood perfectly still in the falling snow as if the cold did not touch them at all, and Tyzik could see that they were watching the families through the windows of the nearby homes. He could not see the stranger's face clearly, but he could see the way they held themselves, and there was something in that posture that Tyzik recognized immediately, and it was the posture of someone who was very tired and very alone. The stranger stood there for a long time, and Tyzik continued to watch while pretending to clean, and he noticed that the other colonists gave the figure a wide space when they passed, and some of them whispered to each other and pointed. When the stranger finally turned toward the light of the coffee shop, Tyzik saw why the others had been afraid. Scales covered the stranger's face and hands, and they gleamed like dark emeralds in the lamplight, and their eyes were like pools of molten gold that seemed to glow from within. And Tyzik knew at once that this was a Draconith. Draconith were rare in human space, and they were known throughout the galaxy as proud and powerful beings who ruled a vast dominion of stars, and they did not often walk among lesser species, and when they did, it was usually as conquerors or diplomats surrounded by guards. But this Draconith was alone, and their cloak was worn, and their movements were slow with exhaustion, and they looked nothing like the fearsome rulers that Tyzik had heard stories about. The stranger stopped at the edge of the light that spilled from the coffee shop windows, and Tyzik could see them hesitate, and he could see them look at the warm glow inside, and then look away as if they did not deserve to enter. Tyzik made a decision in that moment, and he walked to the door and opened it, and the cold rushed in, but he did not care. "You look like you could use something warm," he said, and his voice was calm and friendly, and he gestured toward the interior of the shop. "Please come inside." The Draconith stared at him, and those golden eyes were filled with confusion and suspicion, and something else that might have been hope. "You invite me in," the stranger said, and their voice was deep and rough like stones grinding together. "You do not know me, and you do not know what I am capable of, and yet you invite me into your home." Tyzik shrugged and smiled and said, "This is a coffee shop, and anyone who wants coffee is welcome, and you look cold and tired, and coffee helps with both of those things." The stranger did not move for a long moment, and Tyzik waited patiently, because he understood that some decisions took time, and he did not want to rush this weary traveler. Finally, the Draconith stepped forward and crossed the threshold, and Tyzik closed the door behind them, and the warmth of the shop wrapped around them like a blanket. Sit anywhere you like," Tysick said as he walked back behind the counter. "I will bring you something good." The stranger chose the corner table, and they sat with their back to the wall and their eyes on the door, and Tysick recognized that habit too, because it was the habit of someone who had learned to always watch for danger. He prepared a cup of his best coffee, and he took his time because good coffee could not be rushed, and when he was satisfied, he carried the cup to the corner table and set it down in front of the stranger. "I cannot pay you," the Draconith said, and there was something like shame in their voice. "I have nothing of value to offer. I did not ask for payment," Tysick replied, and he sat down across from the stranger because he sensed that this being needed company more than they needed coffee. "This one is free, and you can pay me back someday if you want, or you can pass the kindness to someone else, and either way is fine with me." The stranger looked at the cup, and then looked at Tysick, and their golden eyes were searching his face for something, and Tysick did not know what they were looking for, but he let them look. "Why?" the Draconith asked, and the single word carried the weight of centuries. "Why would you show kindness to an unknown Draconith? And why would you risk the anger of your people by inviting me inside? And why would you give me something for nothing?" Tysick thought about the question, and he thought about his wife, who had died 3 years ago, and he thought about how alone he had felt after she was gone, and he thought about all the small kindnesses that had helped him survive those dark days. "Because you looked cold," he said simply, "and because you look lonely, and I know what loneliness feels like, and I would not wish it on anyone." The Draconith was silent for a long time, and then they reached out with clawed hands that trembled slightly, and they lifted the cup to their lips, and they drank. Tysick watched as the stranger tasted coffee for the first time, and he saw the surprise in those golden eyes, and he saw the way their shoulders relaxed just a little, and he knew that he had made the right choice. "This is," the Draconith began and then stopped and tried again. "I have never tasted anything like this, and it is bitter and warm and somehow comforting. And I do not understand how something so simple can feel so." They trailed off, and Tysick smiled and said, "That is the magic of coffee, and it does not solve problems, but it makes them easier to carry for a little while. I am called HFY," the stranger said, and Tysick could tell that the name was invented on the spot, but he did not mind because everyone deserved their secrets. "I am Jan Tysick," he replied, "and you are welcome here, HFY, and you are welcome here whenever you need a warm place to rest." The Draconith named HFY looked at him with those ancient golden eyes, and for a moment, Tysick thought he saw something break behind them, and he thought he saw walls that had stood for centuries begin to crack. "Thank you," HFY whispered, and those 2 words seemed to cost them greatly. "Thank you, Jan Tysick." Outside the wind howled, and the snow fell, and the colony of Vareth 7 settled into the long winter night. But inside the warm cup, a human and a dragon sat together in comfortable silence and shared the simple gift of warmth and company, and neither of them knew yet how much that moment would change everything. The weeks passed slowly on Vareth 7 as winter tightened its grip on the small colony, and the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, and the people drew closer together for warmth and comfort. HFY returned to the warm cup every evening. Without fail, they always arrived after the sun had set, and they always sat at the same corner table, with their back to the wall, and they always ordered coffee, even though Tysick never asked them to pay, and they always stayed until the shop closed. For the night, the colonists noticed, and they whispered among themselves about the strange Draconith who had taken up residence in their midst, and they wondered why Tysick allowed such a creature to stay, and they worried about what might happen if the dragon grew angry. But Tysick paid no attention to their whispers, and he treated HFY the same way he treated every other customer, and he greeted them warmly each evening, and he brought them coffee, and he sat with them when the shop was quiet, and they talked about small things. He learned that HFY had traveled very far to reach this tiny world on the edge, of human space, and he learned that they had not rested properly in many years, and he learned that they carried some great burden that they could not or would not name. He did not push for answers because he understood that trust could not be forced, and he simply offered his company and his coffee, and he let Silwa reveal what they wished to reveal in their own time. 1 evening, Taisik decided to teach Silwa about the different ways to prepare coffee, and he showed them how to grind the beans and how to measure the water and how to control the temperature, and he explained that coffee was not just a drink but a ritual that humans had practiced for centuries. HFY watched with fascination, and their golden eyes followed every movement of Taisik's hands, and they asked questions that surprised him with their depth and curiosity. Why do humans create rituals around food and drink? HFY asked as they watched the dark liquid drip slowly into the cup. Among my people, we consume what we need and nothing more, and we do not attach meaning to the act of eating or drinking. Taisik thought about the question as he finished preparing the coffee, and then he carried 2 cups to the table and sat down across from his unusual friend. I think it is because humans are social creatures, he said. We need connection with others, and sharing a meal or a drink is one of the oldest ways we have found to create that connection. And when we sit down together and eat or drink, we are saying that we trust each other and that we want to spend time together. Silwa lifted their cup and inhaled the rich aroma, and their eyes closed briefly in what might have been pleasure. But you share your food and drink with strangers, they said. You shared with me when you did not know me at all, and you continue to share even though I have given you nothing in return, and I do not understand this. Loneliness is a universal wound, Taisik replied, and his voice was gentle and kind. It does not matter if you are human or Draconith or any other species in the galaxy, because we all feel it and we all suffer from it. And sharing a table is how humans try to heal that wound, and it works best when we share with strangers, because strangers can become friends. Silwa was quiet for a long time after that, and Taisik did not interrupt their thoughts, and he simply drank his coffee and watched the snowfall outside the window. The peaceful evening was shattered when the door burst open, and 3 colonists stumbled inside, with the smell of alcohol heavy on their breath, and their faces twisted with anger and fear. There it is, the largest one slurred as he pointed at Silwa. The monster that has been lurking in our town, and we should have driven it out weeks ago. Taisik stood up slowly and positioned himself between the drunk men and Silwa's table, and his face was calm but his eyes were hard. You need to leave, he said quietly. You are drunk, and you are being rude to my customer, and I will not allow that in my shop. Your customer. Another man laughed bitterly. That thing is not a customer, and it is not even a person, and it is a Draconith, and everyone knows what they are like, and they think they are better than everyone else, and they look down on us like we are insects. Silwa had not moved from their seat, and their face showed no emotion, but Taisik could see their clawed hands gripping the edge of the table with enough force to leave marks in the wood. I said, leave. Taisik repeated, and he took a step toward the men. Now, the largest man shoved Taisik aside and advanced toward Silwa's table, and his hands were clenched into fists, and his face was ugly with hatred. We do not want your kind here, dragon, he spat. Go back to your empire and leave us alone. Taisik grabbed the man's arm and spun him around, and his grip was stronger than anyone expected from a coffee shop owner, and his voice was cold as winter ice. I will not tell you again, he said. Get out of my shop, and do not come back until you can behave like civilized people. And if you ever threaten one of my customers again, you will answer to me. The men looked at Taisik, and they saw something in his eyes that made them hesitate, and they remembered that this quiet man had been a starship engineer before he came to Verith 7, and they wondered what else he might have been. They left without another word, and the door slammed shut behind them, and the shop was quiet once more. Taisik returned to the table and sat down across from Silwa, and he picked up his coffee cup as if nothing had happened. Ciola stared at him with an expression he could not read, and their golden eyes were wide with something that might have been shock. "You defended me," they said, and their voice was barely a whisper. "You put yourself between me and danger, and you risked their anger to protect me. And no one has done that for me in centuries. You are my friend," Tysic said simply, "and friends look out for each other." Ciola looked down at the table, and when they spoke again, their voice was heavy with old pain. "Among the Draconiths, showing vulnerability is forbidden," they said. "Emperors and lords do not sit in small shops on frontier worlds, and they do not accept kindness from beings. They are supposed to consider lesser, and they do not let others see them as anything other than strong and invincible." Tysic smiled and reached across the table and patted Ciola's clawed hand gently. "Good thing you are just Ciola then," he said. "And Ciola is allowed to sit wherever they want and drink coffee with whoever they want and be as vulnerable as they need to be." Ciola looked at him, and something shifted in those ancient golden eyes, and Tysic saw gratitude there. And he saw wonder, and he saw the beginning of something that might have been hope. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the winter continued to deepen, but inside the warm cup of friendship continued to grow, and neither the human nor the dragon knew yet just how important that friendship would become.